This is a fictional story inspired by common themes of family betrayal. It does not promote harm or violence. If you're dealing with abuse, seek help from professionals like elder abuse hotlines. No real events or persons depicted. The champagne glass slipped from Evelyn's hand the moment she hit the floor. My son-in-law's mother was convulsing on the polished wood, foam collecting at the corners of her mouth. Guests gasped. Someone screamed for help. But all I could think was this: that glass was meant for me. I had raised it just minutes earlier, smiling as any gracious hostess would. After selling my lakefront estate for $22 million, it felt only right to toast a lifetime of work. A house that held my late husband's laughter, my daughter's childhood, and my own sacrifices. But the man who married my daughter, the one with a smile just slick enough to cover the cracks in his life, had already fixed my toast. Mark, my son-in-law. He had insisted on organizing this retirement party. "Kathleen, you've worked too hard not to celebrate," he said, pressing, charming, convincing. His voice could win over most people. It never fooled me. That night, as music played and the lake reflected the glow of lanterns outside, I caught him at the drinks table. His movements were too careful, too deliberate. A vial appeared between his fingers, no larger than a travel perfume bottle. He poured it into the glass he knew I always used, the one with the tiny chip along the rim. A flaw I never minded because my late husband Frank once teased me for refusing to throw it away. To anyone else, it was just a glass. To me, it was memory. To Mark, it was a target. So when he offered the flute with a smile, saying, "Mother, you deserve this," I took it. I even thanked him. And I waited. I waited until he turned his back to flash his Rolex at a neighbor, until laughter rose high enough to cover the clink of glass. Then I switched mine with Evelyn's, setting it quietly by her purse. Evelyn, kind but distracted, reached for the nearest drink without noticing the chip at the rim. She raised it to her lips, trusting her son more than anyone in the room. 5 minutes later, she collapsed. That is how my story begins. Before I take you further, let me pause for just a breath. If you're listening now, if you've ever felt underestimated or overlooked, stay with me. And if this story strikes something in you already, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or turning on the bell. It helps more than you know, and it tells me these truths are worth sharing. Now, back to that night. I stood still, holding my breath as Evelyn writhed. Around me, guests surged into chaos. Laura, my only daughter, Mark's wife, clutched her phone, dialing for an ambulance. Panic sharp in her voice. Mark dropped to his knees, shouting for help, his performance almost convincing. Almost. I'd seen genuine fear before. His was theater. And me? I stayed kneeling, by Evelyn's side, pressing a hand to hers. Not because I didn't know what had happened, but because I did. I remember thinking how strange it was, the symmetry of it all. I had just sold the estate on the lake, the place Frank and I built from nothing, and I thought this party would be a closing chapter. Instead, it became a test of survival. The lake glimmered through the windows behind the crowd, silver under the moonlight. I could hear the water moving gently, steady and calm, while inside this house, chaos erupted. That contrast carved itself into my memory. The stillness of the lake, the frenzy of the room, and my own silence in the middle. No one noticed that my glass, the chipped one, sat untouched on the counter now. No one noticed the way Mark's eyes flicked to it once, twice, then away. He was too busy calling Evelyn's name, shaking her shoulder as if he had no idea why she was down. But I had seen every move. In moments like that, people expect confrontation, a scream, an accusation, a scene. But I learned a long time ago, in boardrooms and negotiations, that the loudest person is rarely the one in control. Power often hides in the quiet. So I said nothing. As paramedics rushed in, as Laura sobbed that she didn't understand, I stood with my hands folded. I let the questions swirl without answers. And inside, I promised myself this. I would not only survive, I would show them exactly what a woman like me could do when underestimated. The chipped glass waited on the counter, glinting under the chandelier. A memory, a weapon, a reminder. That was the beginning. I suppose it is time I tell you who we all are, because without knowing the players, you cannot understand the game that was unfolding around me. My name is Kathleen Moore. I am 68 years old, a widow for nearly 2 decades. Frank, my husband, passed away suddenly, leaving me with a daughter to raise and a small consulting firm that everyone assumed would collapse without him. Instead, I carried it on my back, piece by piece, until it grew into something worth $22 million. That was the value the buyer placed on my lakefront estate, the heart of my life's work. People sometimes describe me as graceful or polite, but beneath the surface I am stubborn, deliberate, and, if I am honest, a little proud. You do not survive decades in a world designed for men without a spine of steel. My daughter, Laura, is my softest spot. She was just a girl when her father died. I did everything to shield her, to keep her world intact. Laura grew into a woman of gentle honesty, the kind who wants to believe the best in everyone. She teaches at a local school, reads novels by the lake, and once told me she never wanted to be rich, just safe, just loved. She married Mark 10 years ago, and though I never said it out loud, I worried from the start. Mark, my son-in-law, knows how to fill a room. He has the kind of smile that photographs well, the handshake that lingers a second too long, the voice that convinces investors to write checks they probably shouldn't. He calls himself a real estate developer. In truth, his projects fail more often than they succeed. Debt clings to him like smoke. But Laura loves him. She insists he is just unlucky, that his time will come. When she looks at him, she sees a husband. When I look at him, I see hunger. Not the hunger that builds, the hunger that consumes. Then there is Evelyn, Mark's mother. She has lived in her son's shadow for so long, she almost disappears in his presence. A small woman with nervous hands, always apologizing for taking up space. She tends to sit quietly at gatherings, smiling politely while conversations swirl past her. People forget she is there. Mark never forgets. He simply overlooks her. And that is why what happened to her at my party was so chilling. If I had not switched the glasses, no one would have noticed the detail of a chipped rim or a mother reaching absent-mindedly for the nearest drink. She was never meant to be the center of the story. Yet fate, or perhaps justice, pushed her into it. My granddaughter, Sophie, is the light I hold on to. Laura and Mark's daughter, 16, clever, observant. She carries a notebook everywhere, scribbling poems, questions, fragments of her world. She once asked me, "Grandma, how do you know when someone is lying?" I told her the truth. You watch the pauses between their words, not the words themselves. Sophie is old enough to notice cracks in her parents' marriage. old enough to hear whispers about money, but still young enough to hope people will change. When she visits me, we bake muffins and sit by the roses Frank planted. She makes me believe not everything is lost in the next generation. And finally, Richard Hale. My attorney, my shield, the man who has stood at my side through contracts, lawsuits, and grief. Richard is precise, thin frame, wire-rimmed glasses, handwriting neat enough to print in textbooks. He does not waste words. He has been with me since the early days of the firm, guiding me through legal storms when competitors tried to sink me, drafting the documents that kept my estate secure. I trust him not because he is perfect, but because he does not flatter me. He tells me the risks, the consequences, the truth. When my instincts flare, Richard is the one who turns those instincts into action the law will recognize. If I had shouted at Mark that night, nothing would have come of it. But with Richard, silence could become a weapon sharpened by paper and ink. So there we were, a widow with a fortune, a daughter who wanted peace, a son-in-law drowning in debt, a mother-in-law who faded into the wallpaper, a granddaughter still innocent enough to believe in goodness, and a lawyer who had seen enough betrayal to prepare for anything. That was the cast of my life on the night of my retirement party. If you imagine us gathered together, picture this: lanterns glowing along the lake, champagne chilled on ice, laughter bouncing off the water. Laura greeting neighbors, her voice warm. Mark shaking hands too firmly. Evelyn adjusting the sleeve of her dress, trying not to spill. Sophie leaning against the railing, sketching faces in her notebook. And me, standing in the middle, holding a glass with a chip no one else noticed, watching everything. That was the scene before the fall. That was the family before one glass tipped and shattered the illusion. Lanterns laced the terrace like a necklace of small moons. Their reflections stitched light across the lake. Inside, a piano app murmured old standards. Outside, neighbors drifted in and out with plates, and crystal chimed each time glasses met. I stood by the windows with the flute I always chose, a slender stem with a tiny chip along the rim. Frank once teased me for keeping it. I kept it because the flaw held a memory. Tonight, the flaw would mark a target. Mark, my son-in-law, played the perfect host. He shook hands, thanked the caterers, laughed easily, sleeves rolled, tie loosened just enough. When he lifted his voice to make a welcome, people turned as if he were a lighthouse. Laura, my daughter, stood beside him with that faithful light in her eyes. I watched the room absorb his charm like warm bread takes butter. It looked effortless. Charm is rarely free. The lake breathed a cool thread through the screen. Lanterns trembled. I have spent decades reading faces across boardroom tables. I watched Mark the same way I watched men who called me ma'am and underestimated me anyway. He drifted toward the champagne, his hands courteous, his posture precise. From his jacket came a vial no larger than a lipstick. Glass, clear, no label. He held it low, unscrewed it while laughing with a neighbor, and tipped it over one flute. Mine. I did not exhale. The liquid darkened the pale gold for a heartbeat and vanished. In business, the one who hides the hand is never invisible. If you watch the shoulder and the breath, you always see it. He slipped the vial back into his pocket, lifted the chipped flute, and turned toward me with devotion painted on. Kathleen, he said, smiling, after selling your lakefront estate for $22 million, you deserve the first toast. His voice rang generous. His eyes measured me like a ledger. I took the glass and felt the nick under my thumb. My pulse fell into its old work rhythm. Steady, cool, practical. You do not win by flinching. I thanked him, raised the flute, and the room applauded. Cameras glinted. Someone whistled. The piano shifted keys. I stepped through the thicket of greeting hands as if I were simply seeking air. Evelyn, his mother, lingered near the buffet, adjusting the strap of her purse. She is a small woman who apologizes for reaching the mustard. She lives in the soft margins of other people's celebrations. Her eyes found mine. She smiled the way women smile when they are trying not to be in the way. I paused beside her and set my flute down near her bag, a hostess making space. Mark had already turned to show a neighbor his watch. I reached for another flute from the tray. Any flute. Fresh, cold, unremarkable. I poured from a different bottle, nodded at a joke, asked whether rain would come off the lake. Conversation rose and fell like a tide against pilings. The chipped glass waited quietly by Evelyn's purse. She reached without looking. Habit chooses for us when attention wanders. Her fingers closed around the stem. She lifted it in a small salute toward me. "Thank you, Kathleen," she said, as if I had given rather than removed. She tasted the champagne. Bubbles caught the lantern light. The lake laid a silver band beyond the windows. I folded a napkin under a sweating pitcher. I asked a neighbor about his grandson's baseball team. Power is not the loudest voice at a party. It is the person who knows when to be still. Mark found me a minute later. I held a different flute. A flicker crossed his face, a quick stutter in the eyes. Then his smile returned as though nothing had slipped. He lifted his hands for quiet. "The MC of my life. Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and the room hushed by agreeable degrees. He told a story about grit and legacy, about the little firm that refused to die. He named sacrifice and called me an inspiration. Cameras pivoted. Guests turned. Laura squeezed my hand. I kept my gaze on the table. The chipped flute rested there again, a truth in plain sight. Evelyn touched her chest and smoothed the fabric at her collarbone. She set the glass down and rubbed her wrist as if a bracelet had grown too tight. No one watched her. They watched the man with the microphone and a future he needed me to finance. The lake kept time against the dock. A soft knock, steady as a clock in another room. "Kathleen," Laura whispered. "Your father would be proud." I thought of Frank rinsing cups at this window, of the afternoon he laughed at the chip and told me a woman could honor a flaw and still serve fine wine. I pressed my thumb to the new flute's smooth rim and said, "Thank you." I shifted half a step toward the glass. The moon threw a road of silver across the water. The lanterns shivered. The piano found a bridge I used to hum while drying dishes. Mark's sentences rounded a corner into the part where he invites the room to raise their glasses. I did not raise mine. I stood still and let the story run around me. Evelyn's eyes searched the air as if reading a word she could not pronounce. I counted my pulse and kept breathing. The chipped glass caught the light and returned it like a signal only I could read. This is how quiet looks when it decides to fight. No shouts, no scene, only a woman who refuses to look away. I stayed ready. Evelyn's knees buckled first. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the hardwood. A spray of bubbles and shards sparkling like cruel confetti. Then her whole body pitched forward. She hit the floor with a sound that cut through the chatter. For a moment, the party froze. Guests stared as if they were waiting for her to laugh, to say it was all a joke. Instead, she began to convulse. Her hands clawed at the air, foam pooling at the corners of her mouth. Mark was the first to drop beside her. "Mom! Mom!" His voice broke in just the right places. His arms wrapped around her shoulders as though he could hold her back from the brink. To anyone else, he looked like the portrait of panic. To me, it was theater, polished from practice. His eyes darted, not just at Evelyn, but toward the table where the chipped glass had fallen. Laura trembled beside me, her phone in her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "What's happening?" "Oh, God. What's happening?" She pressed the screen with frantic fingers, fumbling the emergency number. I placed my own phone against my ear, calm, steady. "This is Kathleen Moore," I told the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance immediately. A woman has collapsed. She's convulsing. She may have ingested something toxic. The address is my residence. Yes, hurry." My voice did not crack. While guests clustered in circles of whispers, I knelt by Evelyn. Her skin was clammy, her breathing ragged. I pressed 2 fingers to her wrist and felt a pulse racing like a cornered bird. Mark looked up at me with wild eyes. "Do something," he hissed, loud enough for only me. I met his gaze and said nothing. The sirens came quickly, flashing red across the lakefront windows. Paramedics swept in, brisk and controlled, pushing past guests with their bags. They knelt where Mark had been kneeling, moving him aside with professional force. One clipped a mask over Evelyn's face. Another injected medication into her arm. I watched the scene with my hands folded, not because I was detached, but because I knew. If I opened my mouth now, I would change the game too early. They lifted Evelyn onto a stretcher, her head rolling, her body slack. Laura clung to my arm. "Mom, is she going to die?" Her voice was that of a child again, the frightened little girl I once held after nightmares. I smoothed her hair. "She's in good hands," I said. I did not add the truth. Evelyn had swallowed what Mark meant for me. At the hospital, white lights bleached the hallways, and antiseptic burned in the air. Laura and I waited in plastic chairs that seemed to squeak with every shift. Mark paced the corridor, pulling his phone from his pocket, sliding it back in, pulling it out again. I wondered who he was desperate to text and who he was afraid might call. Finally, a doctor appeared. His coat was wrinkled from long hours. His face held the grave composure of bad news practiced often. "Mrs. Peterson has stabilized," he told us. "She ingested something we believe to be a toxic plant extract. Dangerous, but not fatal in the amount consumed. We've flushed her system, but she'll need observation." "Plant alkaloid?" Laura repeated. She shook her head, her voice brittle. That sounds like poison. Are you saying she was poisoned?" No, she must have taken the wrong medication. She takes so many pills, but I knew Evelyn was meticulous. I had seen her organize her prescriptions in a plastic case, labeled by day and hour. She never mixed them. I could have corrected Laura, but I didn't. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding the doctor's eyes. Could it be food? Something at the party? Seafood allergy, maybe? He forced a laugh that died quickly in the sterile air. The doctor shook his head. Unlikely. The symptoms and the toxicology we've begun suggest ingestion of a mysterious substance. We'll know more once the lab reports return. I thanked him politely. Laura kept shaking her head, muttering that it didn't make sense, that maybe Evelyn had taken something before the party. Mark slipped his hands into his pockets and stared at the floor tiles. I sat very still. In silence, I heard everything. Laura's desperate denial, Mark's quick deflection, the doctor's calm certainty. I thought of the chipped glass, the vial, the deliberate tilt of Mark's hand. Inside myself, I drew a line. I will not scream. I will not accuse. I will not give him the satisfaction of panic. I will wait. I will watch. And when I move, it will be final. So I sat in that waiting room, back straight, hands folded, and told myself the words I have carried since that night. I will not shout. I will wait. When I returned home from the hospital, the house was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, even the whisper of the wind off the lake. All of it pressed down on me as if silence itself were testing how much I could hold. I set my purse on the table, hung up my coat, and stood still in the kitchen. On the counter sat a bouquet Laura had arranged for the party, tulips bent from neglect. They looked like guests who had overstayed. I poured myself a glass of water and drank slowly, steadying my hands. I could have collapsed into bed, let exhaustion sweep me under. Instead, I walked into Frank's old study, now mine. The desk still bore a faint scratch from when Sophie, at 6 years old, carved her initials into the wood. I opened the drawer and pulled out a thick envelope of stationery. If ever there was a night for truth, it was this one. I began to write. Frank, tonight I saw our daughter's husband try to kill me. He thought he was careful, but I watched. I saw the vial, the pour, the way he smiled as though generosity were in his bones. I switched glasses. Your memory, the small chip you once teased me for keeping, saved me. Evelyn drank instead. She nearly died. I called for help while Mark pretended panic. He thinks I am blind. He has forgotten who I am. The words came quickly, ink scratching in the stillness. I wanted you there, Frank. I wanted your hand on my shoulder, your laugh cutting through the lies. I wanted someone to tell me I am not imagining this. Laura denies, of course. She believes her husband still. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, she is too young to see the rot underneath the varnish. So I write to you because you knew me when I was not yet hard, when the world had not taught me that silence can be sharper than any blade. I stopped, breathed, and let the pen rest. My eyes found the window, and through it, the roses you planted 20 years ago. The first spring after you died, I thought they would wither. I nearly tore them out. But they bloomed, stubbornly, as if they were proof you had not left me entirely. I remembered the day you dug the soil. Sophie was a baby. Laura chased her shadow across the grass. You wiped your brow, looked at me, and said, "These roses will outlive us both." I laughed at the time, dismissing it as sentiment. Yet here they are, still rising, still red. I wonder if that was your way of leaving me a weapon, something alive, rooted, impossible to erase. I dipped the pen again. Frank, I will not scream. That is what he expects. I will not accuse. He would twist it, call me senile, call me bitter, number. I will wait. I will watch. And when the time comes, I will move with precision, just as you taught me when we negotiated that first impossible contract. Do you remember? You said the trick was letting the other man think he had already won. Tonight, Mark believed I was finished. He believed the fortune we built together would soon pass to his hands. He forgot that I am still breathing, still sharp, still yours in spirit. My hand trembled for the first time since the party. Not from fear, grief, maybe. The grief of writing to a man who would never answer. I pressed the page flat, finished the letter. If you are anywhere, if you see me from a distance, know this. I will not let him take what we built. I will not let our daughter be dragged under by his debts. I will not let Sophie grow up thinking money excuses cruelty. I will protect them, even if it means standing against the people they love. I will protect myself, too, because you once told me that dignity is the only inheritance that matters, and I intend to keep mine. I signed only my first name, Kathleen. It felt less lonely that way. I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope without sealing it, and carried it to the shelf where our photo albums rested. The one on top bore a faded label, Summer at the Lake. I tucked the letter inside, behind a picture of Frank kneeling in the dirt with rose thorns on his gloves, smiling at me as though he had already guessed this moment would come. When I closed the album, I pressed my palm against its cover. The roses outside shifted in the night breeze, their stems strong, their blooms unbothered by the dark. I let the image anchor me. Then I whispered aloud, though the room was empty, I will wait, Frank. I will wait, and I will be ready. With that, I turned off the lamp and left the study. The letter remained, sealed not with wax, but with resolve, an unsent prayer, a confession, and a promise, all in one. The morning after Evelyn's collapse, I drove downtown with a steadiness I did not entirely feel. The city was waking, delivery trucks at corners, commuters clutching coffee cups. The ordinary rhythm of people who still believed life followed rules. My hands stayed tight on the wheel. The chipped glass from the party haunted me. I could see it every time I blinked. That small imperfection, once a joke between Frank and me, had nearly been my gravestone. Richard Hale's office occupied the 15th floor of a building I had walked into many times over the years. The lobby smelled faintly of polish and money. I signed my name in the log, rode the elevator, and reminded myself I was not here to panic. I was here to prepare. His secretary greeted me with the warmth of routine. "Good morning, Mrs. Moore. He's expecting you." She ushered me into the office, dark wood and leather, books stacked with quiet authority. Richard rose from behind his desk, glasses catching the light. "Kathleen," he said, extending his hand. "It's been too long. Sit. Tell me what's brought you." I sank into the chair opposite him and folded my hands. I told him everything. I told him about the party, about the vial in Mark's hand, about the glass with the chip, about Evelyn collapsing on my floor. I told him about the hospital, about the doctor mentioning plant alkaloids, about Laura's frantic denial, about Mark's deflections. I did not embellish. I simply laid out the facts like documents on a table. Richard listened without interrupting, though I could see his jaw tighten at certain points. He scribbled a few notes, underlining once, then twice. When I finished, the room was quiet, except for the hum of the city through the windows. He set down his pen. "You're certain about what you saw?" he asked. "As certain as I am that I'm sitting here," I replied. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and let out a slow breath. "Then we have to assume two things. First, that your son-in-law has already tried to remove you. Second, that he will try again, and not necessarily in the same way." I nodded, though my throat was tight. "What are my risks?" He reached for a file and opened it, his tone shifting into the clinical cadence I remembered from past battles. The most immediate risk is financial. You've just liquidated a major asset for $22 million. That's fresh blood in the water. If Mark is in debt, and I suspect he has motive to access those funds quickly. I waited. He adjusted his glasses. There are 3 standard avenues for someone like him. 1, outright theft, but that leaves evidence. 2, persuasion, convincing you to sign a power of attorney, which would give him control over your finances. And 3, incapacity claims. If he and your daughter argue that you're no longer mentally competent, they can petition for guardianship. That would put your assets under their control for your benefit. In practice, it means you'd lose the ability to decide anything for yourself. I felt my stomach clench, but I kept my voice steady. Guardianship. On what grounds? Your age, the recent sale, stress, grief. It doesn't take much. Families have won cases with far less. All they need is a cooperative psychiatrist to declare you unfit. Once that happens, the court steps in. You'd be assigned a guardian, likely your daughter or son-in-law, and every financial and medical decision would be theirs. If they want to move you to a nursing facility, they can. If they want to liquidate your assets, they can. I thought of Mark showing me brochures for Sunset Hills, his tone syrupy with concern. I thought of Laura clutching my hand, whispering, "Mom, it's safer for you there." My chest tightened with something between rage and grief. Richard's eyes narrowed. Has he suggested a nursing home already? Yes, I said quietly. He brought paperwork. He said it was for my safety. That fits, Richard replied. Isolate you in a facility. Surround you with staff who'll write notes about confusion or forgetfulness. Build a paper trail. Then bring in a psychiatrist to certify what they've already staged. Once you're declared incompetent, every choice is theirs. The silence in the office stretched. I pressed my hands together, nails biting into my palms. So they want to strip me of my dignity while I'm still breathing. Richard looked at me steadily. Then we take precautions now. We make your competence undeniable. We create a fortress of paperwork so tight that even if they try, the law will be on your side. For a long moment, I said nothing. I watched the traffic move far below, people carrying briefcases, cars sliding through green lights. They had no idea how fragile a life could be. Finally, I nodded. If they plan to take my dignity with paper, then I'll take it back the same way. If they want control, they'll find nothing but walls. A flicker of approval crossed Richard's face. Good. Here's what we do. First, I'll schedule an evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist I trust, someone with a reputation for honesty. You'll be certified competent in writing, immediately. That goes into the file. Second, we restructure your estate. Right now, your assets are too exposed. We'll move them into trusts, tighten access, and appoint neutral trustees. That way, even if Mark waived a power of attorney under a banker's nose, there'd be nothing for him to touch. Third, we draft directives: medical, financial, personal. You decide today who can and cannot make choices for you if something happens. Their names will not be on any of it. I sat taller. And my will? We update it. Cut out what doesn't serve your peace. Redirect to charities if you wish. Give Laura what you think is right, but make it conditional, protected. Leave Mark nothing. My lips curved, not in joy, but in recognition. If he wants a fight, he'll get one he can't win. Richard closed the file. Kathleen, I've known you 20 years. You don't rattle easily. You're playing a long game now. Just remember, silence is power when you have the documents to back it. I rose, smoothing my jacket. The roses outside swayed in the morning wind, red against gray concrete. I placed my hand on the desk, steady. Thank you, Richard. I will not scream. I will not accuse. I will wait. And when I sign, it will be final. The meeting ended with a handshake, firm and deliberate. Paperwork justice had begun. The day after meeting Richard, I knew I needed more than legal walls. Paperwork would protect me, but only if I had proof of what was already circling beneath the surface. Mark was clever in appearances. He understood how to wear charm like a tailored suit. What he underestimated was my memory of running a business in a world that tried daily to bankrupt me. Men like him always left trails. You just had to hire the right eyes to follow them. That is how Patricia Williams entered the picture again. Patricia ran a private investigation firm I had used in my consulting years, whenever a potential partner seemed too glossy. She was quick, discreet, and meticulous. I dialed her number, and her voice came through the line, warm and steady. "Kathleen Moore," she said. "It's been a while. You sold the estate, didn't you? Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, "but I'm calling because I need your help." This time, it's personal. Patricia was silent for a beat, then asked, "Is this about your son-in-law?" Her perception startled me, though it shouldn't have. People like Patricia see patterns others miss. "Yes," I admitted. "I need to know everything about his financial life. Debt, loans, insurance policies, anything. And quickly, you'll have it in 48 hours, she promised. True to her word, Patricia sat across from me 2 days later in a quiet cafe, a manila envelope between us. She slid it across the table, her eyes sharp. "I'll walk you through it," she said. Inside were pages of bank statements, loan records, credit reports. The first sheet alone made my pulse slow into the deliberate rhythm it takes when truth crystallizes. Mark's debts weren't just high, they were catastrophic. His real estate company had been operating at a loss for 3 years. 2 mortgages on their house, both behind on payments. Credit cards maxed out, with balances over $80,000. "They're robbing Peter to pay Paul," Patricia explained. "Credit cards to cover other credit cards, lines of credit tapped out. It's a cycle that only ends in collapse." I turned the page. And this? Patricia tapped her pen against a line highlighted in yellow. 6 months ago, Mark took out a life insurance policy. $500,000. Guess who the insured is? My chest tightened. "Me." Patricia nodded. "He listed you as the covered individual, with his wife Laura as the beneficiary, but the paperwork was clearly prepared by him. He positioned himself as handling the details, probably so Laura wouldn't ask questions she didn't want answered." I ran my fingers over the page, bile rising in my throat. "So, if I die, Laura receives $500,000, and he gets access to the $22 million from the estate." "It's motive in black and white," Patricia said quietly. I looked up at her, holding her gaze. "That's not all, is it?" She pulled another document from the envelope. 3 months ago, he began making payments to a psychiatrist, a Dr. Richard Steinberg. Small amounts at first, then increasing. Regular consultations. The timing lines up with your estate sale. I frowned. "What kind of psychiatrist?" "Geriatric," Patricia replied. "Specializes in competency evaluations." I stared at the name on the page, the letters blurring for a moment. Richard had warned me of this exact scenario. Establish a pattern of supposed confusion, then bring in a professional willing to certify incompetence. With Steinberg on his side, Mark could present me as incapable of handling my own affairs. Guardianship would follow, and with it, control of everything Frank and I built. Patricia leaned in. I've seen Steinberg's name before. Families in disputes. Cases where the elder swore they were fine, but somehow wound up in facilities with all assets transferred. His reports always seem to favor whoever pays him. The cafe noise faded to a low hum. I thought of the way Mark had pressed Sunset Hills brochures into my hands, his voice syrupy with concern. I thought of Laura's trembling insistence that it would be safer for me there. And now this, a psychiatrist already on the payroll, ready to brand me as unfit. They've been planning this for months, I murmured. Not days, not weeks, months. Patricia touched my wrist gently. You're not powerless, Kathleen. You hired me. You already know. That's your strength? I gathered the papers back into the envelope. Thank you, Patricia. You've given me exactly what I needed. Proof. As I drove home, the roses in my front yard caught my eye. Their red blooms glowed against the dark soil, stubborn and alive. I thought of Frank planting them, his hands dirty, his voice light. These roses will outlive us both. I parked the car and sat in the driveway, gripping the wheel. My son-in-law had debts deep enough to drown him, and he wanted to use me as the lifeboat. He had bought an insurance policy on my life, as though I were already dead. He had hired a psychiatrist to erase my competence before I could defend myself. But he forgot one thing. I am still breathing, and I am still watching. Richard would know what to do with this information. Together, we would turn their own strategies against them. If Mark thought paperwork could strip me of dignity, he was about to learn that paperwork could also become a sword. I carried the envelope inside, placed it beside Frank's unsent letter in the album, and whispered to the roses outside the window, "He will not win." The knock came just after noon, 3 soft taps like an apology. On my phone's camera, I saw Evelyn on the porch, small as a question mark, one hand gripping a little purse. I opened the door and stepped back so she could cross the threshold. She would not sit until I asked twice. Even then, she perched on the edge of the chair, knees together, eyes on the window where the roses moved in the breeze. Her lipstick was smudged, and her hair showed the flat line of a hurried scarf. A woman trying to hide inside a tidy version of herself and failing. "Tea?" I asked. "Yes," she whispered. Then, like a child, "If it's no trouble." I brought chamomile and waited with the patience grief teaches. She cupped the mug in both hands. We sat in quiet until the steam thinned. "I remember the taste," she said. "Metallic, bitter, like sucking on a penny." Her eyes lifted to mine. I saw him at the table. Not clearly, just the way his shoulders went tight, the way his head turned to check whether anyone was watching. A bottle between his fingers. Small. She blinked. "He did something to that glass." "I know," I said. The admission buckled her. She set the mug down and pressed her hands to her face. "Kathleen, my son tried to kill you." The word son scraped the air. I raised a boy who knew better. But I kept forgiving him for little lies because I was afraid he would leave me. "You do not have to carry his choices," I said. "You are not responsible for what he poured into that flute." She shook her head. "I should have seen him sooner." He is always dressing the wound with charm. I looked at the bandage and not the blood. She smoothed her skirt, a habit learned to vanish. He thinks money will finally make him safe. Evelyn, can you tell the police what you told me? She stared at the roses. Her mouth trembled. He is my child. I waited. He is also a man who tried to erase me, I said calmly. And he almost erased you by accident. She flinched, then straightened. He cannot have your life for his debts, she said. I will testify to what I saw. I will tell them about the taste and the bottle and the way he smiled when he handed you the glass. I will tell them I wanted to believe he was good. Thank you, I said. Your truth will matter. She nodded. Kathleen, I need to say something that will not be kind. Laura loves him. She will take his side until evidence drags her elsewhere. She is not cruel. She is loyal beyond reason. I know, I said. Loyalty is beautiful until it becomes a blindfold. Evelyn studied me. You are strong, she said. I have spent my life trying to be small enough to be tolerated. You refuse to be small. I am only as large as the truth, I answered. She exhaled. I never wanted money from you. When Mark brought me into his plans, I told myself he was talking about keeping you safe. I thought he meant a retirement place. That is the mouth a lie uses. It borrows the voice of care. We let silence sit between us like a witness. The clock ticked evenly. Will they put him in prison? She asked. That is not for me to decide, I said. My work is to tell the truth and to protect what Frank and I built. Your work is to protect what remains of you. Evelyn reached for her purse and removed a folded paper. I wrote down what I remember, she said. The time he held the bottle, where you were standing, the label on the champagne. I even took a picture of the flute with the chip a few weeks ago because I thought it was pretty. She placed the page in my hands, then a small photograph. The flaw gleamed like a crescent moon. May I keep these? They are yours. Use them. I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she paused. She turned, eyes bright but clear. If they ask whether I love my son, I will say yes. I will also say love is not a shield for harm. I did not know that until today. You know it now, I said. That is enough. On the porch, she stood taller than when she arrived. The wind had freshened. The lake shone pale under the afternoon light. The roses held steady. I watched her go. Then I went back inside, slid her statement and the photograph into the album beside my letter to Frank, and closed the cover with my palm laid flat. In every story, there is a woman who decides to stop apologizing. Today, it was Evelyn. Because she stepped forward, I could stay still a little longer, gathering my silence like a blade I would not draw until the law was ready to hold it. They arrived together late in the afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase that looked too heavy for what it held. Mark set it on my dining table with the air of a man delivering salvation. Laura followed, her eyes red-rimmed, carrying a folder tucked to her chest as though it might steady her. Mom, she began softly, we've been thinking about you since the party. About how frightening it was when Evelyn collapsed. What if that had been you? I poured coffee for all of us, though only I drank. The roses outside were just catching the last light, their shadows reaching across the window glass. Mark opened the briefcase. Contracts, brochures, glossy photographs of sunset hills spilled across the wood. It's not a nursing home, he said, as if anticipating my objection. It's a community. Look at this. Private cottages, medical staff on site, cultural programs. You'd have friends, activities, and most of all, safety. Laura placed a hand over mine. Her fingers trembled. Mom, please. I can't stop thinking about what might happen if you were alone and something went wrong. I don't want to lose you. Her tears caught me off guard. My throat ached with the weight of loving her, even when her loyalty bent toward the wrong man. I'm fine here, I said gently. No, Mark interrupted, his tone smooth. You think you're fine. But safety isn't about how you feel. It's about preparation. If you had collapsed that night, who would have called for help? Who would have been here? I looked at him, remembering the vial between his fingers, the way his eyes had searched for mine when Evelyn hit the floor. He had the nerve to cloak attempted murder in the language of care. Laura's tears slid faster. Mom, it isn't about control. It's about love. We need you with us. We can visit all the time. Sunset Hills is only 20 minutes away. Please consider it. She pulled a contract from the folder, pages already tabbed for signatures. Mark slid another across the table. The facility requires a financial disclosure, he said briskly, and a power of attorney on file, just standard practice, so that if something happens, decisions can be made quickly. Nothing unusual. It's for your protection I picked up the document, flipping through. Lines of legal text blurred together. I recognized the broad strokes immediately, sweeping authority over bank accounts, investments, property. With one signature, they would have access to everything Frank and I had built. Laura squeezed my hand harder. Mom, please don't be angry. I want you safe. My heart ached for her. She wasn't lying. She believed him, believed the glossy brochures and his honeyed assurances. She was my daughter, still the child who brought me dandelions, who clung to me at funerals, who wanted only peace. It hurt more than any betrayal to see her used as a weapon against me. I kept my face composed. This seems like a lot of authority to hand over, I murmured, as though considering. Only technical, Mark said quickly. It's nothing more than paperwork. Think of it as insurance. $500,000 on my life, filed 6 months ago, Laura's name as beneficiary. His words curdled in my stomach, but my smile never wavered. Very well, I said finally. If it gives you peace, I'll sign. Mark's eyes flashed triumph. Laura sagged with relief, tears brightening into hope. I took the pen he offered, my hand steady. I signed where he pointed, initialed where he directed. I folded the contract neatly, slid it back toward him, and pushed the power of attorney page across with my signature already written. Thank you, Mom, Laura whispered. She kissed my cheek, damp and trembling. You won't regret this. No, I said softly. I won't. They gathered the papers quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind. Mark closed the briefcase with a snap and pressed both hands on it like a prize. His smile was practiced, but his relief was real. He thought the fortress had fallen. I walked them to the door. Laura hugged me tightly. Mark offered a kiss to the cheek I did not lean into. They left together, their shadows long against the driveway. When their car disappeared down the street, I returned to the table. From the drawer, I pulled out Richard's duplicate set, the documents he had prepared for this very moment. The power of attorney I had signed did not grant access to millions. It granted control over one account, deliberately created, containing exactly $1. I traced the ink of my signature, then closed the folder with a quiet satisfaction. Paperwork had always been my weapon of choice. Tonight, it was sharper than any blade. Out the window, the roses stirred in the evening breeze, their petals steady despite the shadows. I whispered to myself, they think they own me now. Let them. They own $1. I still own my dignity. The doorbell rang just as the light on the lake shifted from gold to steel. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Detective Alvarez stood on the porch with another officer. Rain dots on their shoulders, purpose in their faces. "Mrs. Moore," she said, voice even. "May we come in?" I stepped aside. The threshold felt like a line drawn with a ruler. On one side, a house dressed for a party that had already ended. On the other, the state, arriving with facts. "We have preliminary toxicology," Alvarez said, setting a folder on my dining table. "From the hospital and from the champagne you turned over. A toxic plant extract. Concentrated." I nodded once. On Richard's advice, the opened bottle from the party had left my kitchen in a sealed bag the morning after. Paperwork has a way of giving truth a spine. She flipped a page. "Timeline matches the onset of symptoms your guest experienced." The lab found the same compound in residue taken from a glass with a small chip on the rim. The chipped glass had been collected too. The flaw that once made me sentimental now served as a signature. A car turned into my driveway. Tires hissed on wet gravel. Through the window, I saw my daughter, Laura, climbing out with hurried hands. A scarf hung from one wrist. Mark followed, jaw set. They had left minutes ago with their briefcase of promises. Now they were back. Laura came in without knocking. "Mom, I left my scarf," she said, then froze at the sight of the officers. Her gaze slid to the folder. "What is this?" "Mrs. Moore," Alvarez asked. "May your daughter and son-in-law join us?" I gestured to the chairs. Mark stayed standing, close enough to the door to feel its pull. Alvarez did not sit. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I'm Detective Alvarez. We're investigating a suspected poisoning at this residence." Mark lifted his palms. "Detective, that was my mother who got sick. The doctor said it might be her medication." "The doctor said it was a toxic substance," I replied quietly. Alvarez kept her eyes on Mark. Whatever it was not a medication. It was a dangerous substance. The second knock was hesitant, like a question that hoped for no answer. I opened the door to find Evelyn on the porch, a familiar purse in her hands. Alvarez had asked her to stop by to confirm a statement. The threshold held again. This time a mother stood on it, deciding which loyalty would carry her name. Evelyn stepped in. She looked at the table, at the folder, at her son. Something in her softened and hardened at once. "Detective," she said, voice small but steady. "I saw him at the drinks table. He held a little bottle. He did something to the glass with the chip. I tasted metal when I drank." She touched her throat as if to prove she could still feel it. I wanted to be wrong. Laura swayed. The scarf slipped from her wrist to the floor. "Mark," she whispered. Her eyes searched his face for the version of him she'd always believed. "Tell me you didn't." Mark's laugh came too fast, too bright. "Mom's confused. Everyone's confused. Why would I poison my own mother? Why would I hurt Kathleen? Look at me, Laura." "This is absurd." Alvarez opened the folder to a photograph, a lab report clipped to it. A mysterious substance in the champagne, the same mysterious substance in your mother's blood. Witness statement, video timestamp from the party, showing your position at the table. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. Mr. Carter, we have a warrant to search your vehicle and your home. Laura sank into a chair as if the floor had given way. She turned her face toward me, eyes wet, and for a heartbeat I saw the child who once hid in my skirts during storms. Mom, she said, voice breaking, I thought you were too hard. I thought you were suspicious for no reason. Now I see you were right. I wanted to gather her. Instead, I laid my palm flat on the table so she would hear its quiet knock, steady as a heartbeat. I had promised myself I would not yell. I had promised I would wait. Mark's mouth thinned. We're done here, he said, reaching for the doorknob. Alvarez stepped between him and the exit with the calm of a tide that does not hurry. Mr. Carter, you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder. Her partner took his wrists. The cuffs clicked with a finality that felt almost gentle. Laura, Mark called over his shoulder, the charm fraying. Honey, this is a mistake. Tell them we were helping your mother. Tell them about Sunset Hills. Laura did not look at him. She stared at her hands, fingers pressed together as if in prayer. Evelyn took one step closer to her son. Then she stopped. I love you, she said, each word clean. Love is not a shield for harm. Alvarez read rights in a clear cadence. My dining room, built for birthdays and homework, held the language of consequence without complaint. The roses beyond the window shifted under the wind. On the floor by Laura's chair, the scarf lay like a dropped line that would not be picked up. They led Mark to the door. He paused at the threshold and turned his head, searching my face for something. Anger, mercy, noise he could use. I gave him nothing. The silence between us rose like a wall he could not see until he ran into it. When the door closed, the house exhaled. Evelyn's shoulders folded. Laura covered her eyes. I stayed standing, one hand still on the table, the other at my side. I had said almost nothing. I did not need to. The facts had spoken. The handcuffs had answered. Some verdicts are shouted by juries. Mine lived in the spaces between words, in the line of a door, in a mother who chose truth, in a daughter who finally saw. In my stillness, sharpened by paper, held steady by roses that refused to stop blooming. That night, the house carried silence like a weight. The police cars were gone, their red and blue washed out by rain, but the echo of handcuffs lingered in the walls. I poured a cup of tea, though I barely tasted it, and sat by the roses Frank had planted outside the window. Their petals glistened with drops, holding their shape even after the storm. Laura came back just after 10. She let herself in with her old key, shoulders hunched, hair damp against her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen, her face streaked with grief that clung like smoke. She didn't ask permission. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands twisting a tissue until it shredded. Mom, she whispered, I don't know how to live with this. I set my cup down. With what? She looked at me as though the words themselves cut her. With Mark being the man he is. With me not seeing it. With you, almost. Her voice broke. I thought he was protecting you. I thought he loved me. And I let him. She stopped, shaking her head. I feel like I betrayed you. The tissue fell apart in her lap. She pressed her palms against her thighs to still them. I leaned forward, studying my daughter the way I used to study contracts, reading between lines no one wanted to admit existed. Laura, I said softly, you believed him because you wanted to. That is not betrayal. That is trust misplaced. Her eyes brimmed again. But I kept telling you to move to Sunset Hills. I pushed the papers in front of you. If you had signed, if you had trusted me. I let her words hang in the air. Then I repeated them back, shifting the weight. You were afraid I would not be safe. I was afraid I would lose myself. Safety means nothing if it costs your soul. She blinked, startled by the mirror of her own language. I didn't think of it that way. I know, I said, because you've lived so long smoothing Mark's edges that you forgot to protect your own. Laura buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Mom, what if I can't forgive myself? What if you can't forgive me? I sat in the stillness. My heart ached. I thought of her as a little girl, hiding behind me when thunder rolled. She had always reached for the nearest shelter. Now she was 39, still reaching, only to find the shelter itself had been the storm. Forgiveness, I said slowly, is not a gift wrapped for someone else. It is the room you build so you don't suffocate in smoke. I can forgive you for believing, because I know belief is what makes us human. But I will not forgive any plan that tried to erase me. She looked up, her tears sharp as glass. So what happens to us? To you and me? The question pierced deeper than Mark's betrayal ever could. My own child, asking if the thread still held. I felt the pull of two truths, my love for her and my duty to my own dignity, both heavy, both real. I don't know yet, I admitted. That's the price of betrayal. It puts time on the witness stand. Laura reached for my hand, desperate. Please, Mom. Don't cut me out. I'll testify. I'll help the police. I'll do whatever you need. I didn't move to take her hand. Not yet. Helping the police isn't for me, I said. It's for truth. Do it because you are willing to live in the light, not because you want me to forget the dark. She withdrew her hand slowly, shame flickering across her face. You think I'm weak. I think, I corrected, you've been taught that loyalty means silence. But silence has two faces. One saves dignity, the other feeds destruction. Tonight, you choose which it is. Laura's shoulders sagged. She nodded as if the truth weighed more than she could bear. I see it now. Too late, but I see it. We sat without speaking for a long time. The clock ticked. The roses outside glowed faintly under the streetlight. I wanted to reach for her, to fold her into the safety of my arms, but another part of me needed distance. Finally, I said, Laura, you are my daughter. Nothing can erase that. But being my daughter does not entitle you to my trust. Trust has to be rebuilt brick by brick. And if you want to build it, you'll need to start with your own backbone. Her tears slowed. She nodded again, the tiniest ember of resolve in her eyes. I will. I rose and walked her to the door. At the threshold, she paused, her hand on the knob. Mom, she said softly, thank you for not slamming the door on me. I didn't slam it, I said, but I did close it halfway. Whether it opens again is up to you. She left, her figure swallowed by night. I stood at the doorway, breathing in the damp air, the roses brushing the sill. My heart twisted with both pain and pride. Forgive or sever? The question lingered, heavy, without answer. But I knew one thing for certain. Silence would be my verdict until Laura proved otherwise. After Laura left that night, the house felt hollow, as though the walls themselves had stepped back to give me space. I set my tea aside and let the stillness pull me into memory. It is a strange thing, how betrayal doesn't always come with shouting, but with a whisper that reminds you of a time when trust was whole. I remembered a summer morning, decades ago. Laura was 7. Frank had insisted we go down to the lake early, before the sun grew heavy. He carried a wicker basket, always the planner, and reached back with his free hand to guide us down the slope. The grass was wet, clinging to our shoes, and Laura slipped more than once, her little hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her pulse beating against my palm. "Hold on to your mother," Frank had said, smiling over his shoulder. "The lake is calm if you're steady." Laura laughed, that high, clear sound children make before the world teaches them to be cautious. She pressed against me, her hair sticking to her forehead, her small fingers locked in mine. When we reached the dock, she refused to let go until Frank crouched down and spread a towel for her to sit. Even then, she clutched my sleeve as though I were the only anchor she trusted. I had thought then, this child will always know where safety lies. The lake shimmered that day, a mirror broken by gentle ripples. Frank pointed out the horizon, told Laura that water carried secrets, that if you listened closely, it could teach you how to be patient. She listened, wide-eyed, her hand still twined in mine. I can still feel her weight leaning against me, small and unquestioning, content to let me be the one who steadied her world. And now, years later, she clung not to me, but to Mark, the man who had looked me in the eye with a vial hidden in his fist, the man who promised her safety while plotting my erasure. Somewhere along the way, Laura had loosened her grip on my hand and given it to someone who dressed lies in velvet. The ache of it pressed against my chest. I thought of the brochures she had slid across my table, her voice trembling with urgency. "Mom, it's safer there." She had meant it. She had believed him. But the irony was cruel. The child who once trusted me to guide her down a slippery hill now begged me to surrender my footing to the very man who had shaken it. I let myself linger in the memory longer, slowing every detail so it would sting. The sound of Frank's laugh, low and sure. The way Laura had leaned back against me, head resting just under my collarbone. The smell of lake water and sun-warmed cedar boards. Safety then was simple. Hold on, keep close, trust the one who loves you. When she grew older, Frank was the one who let her go first. Into the lake, into the car, into new chapters. He believed in the strength she had yet to see. I had always been the one she circled back to. The steady shore. But tonight, when she reached for my hand at the table, I had not given it. Not because I didn't love her, but because I needed her to understand what she had done. She had let someone else lead her into shadows and called it light. The memory blurred. I pressed my fingers against the window pane, the roses outside glowing faintly under the street lamp. Their red blooms looked almost black in the dark, yet they held their shape. Frank had planted them by hand. He said roses were honest. They wore their beauty and their thorns in the same breath. Looking at them now, I thought, love is like that too. You cannot have the bloom without respecting the thorn. Laura had forgotten that. She had chosen comfort over truth, and in doing so, she had nearly left me rootless. I closed my eyes and whispered into the silence, as though Frank still stood on that dock with us. She used to hold my hand. Now she lets him lead. The words broke something inside me. Tears came, slow and hot. Not the kind of tears that beg for comfort, but the kind that carve lines of clarity. I wept not just for betrayal, but for the child Laura once was. the girl who trusted so fiercely, who looked at me like I was the center of her safety. When the tears ebbed, I breathed deep. The memory had done its work. It had reminded me that my pain was not born of hate, but of love stretched thin and frayed. And love, even bruised, still holds power. I folded the dish towel on the counter, steadied my breath, and faced the quiet house. My heart knew the truth. I could not carry Laura's blindness for her anymore. She would have to walk down her own slope, gripping or slipping, until she found her footing again. For now, I would stand where I always had, on the shore, unshaken. The trial began in early spring, the kind of season when the lake thawed unevenly, cracked sheets of ice, drifting like forgotten promises. I sat in the back of the courtroom, a shawl around my shoulders, and watched as Mark was led to the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him. His charm looked brittle under the fluorescent lights, as if even the fabric refused to hold him upright. Laura sat 2 rows ahead, her hands twisted around a rosary she hadn't touched since childhood. She wouldn't meet my eyes. When she did glance back once, it was quick, guilty, as though she feared my gaze might burn. Sophie sat between us, her shoulders tense. 16 is too young to carry that kind of shame, but there she was, face pale, lips pressed together, watching her father avoid accountability until the evidence pinned him like a moth. The prosecutor laid out the facts plainly: the vial, the oleander, the insurance policy, the debt. Evelyn's testimony cut through the room like cold water. When she said, "I saw him at the table with the bottle," I tasted the bitterness myself. Her voice didn't shake. She was finally done shrinking for her son. Mark tried to smile at the jury, the same way he'd smiled at me that night when he pressed the poisoned glass into my hand. But this time, the smile held no weight. Each witness stripped another layer away until nothing was left but desperation. When the verdict came, guilty of attempted murder, Laura crumpled into herself. Sophie laid a hand on her mother's shoulder, but she didn't cry. She only looked at me with eyes too old for her age, as if silently asking, "How do we survive the people we love?" The sentence was 15 years. The gavel fell, and the sound carried like a door slamming shut. Afterward, neighbors whispered when I walked to the post office or the market, "That's her, the one whose son-in-law tried to poison her." Or worse, her own daughter sided with him for so long. What a scandalous family. I kept my head high, but solitude weighed heavy. The phone stayed quiet most nights. Invitations dwindled. Some friends pulled back, uneasy about being near someone whose family had been paraded across courtrooms and headlines. Respectability, I learned, is as fragile as glass, and people fear the shards might cut them too. Laura withdrew from me almost completely. She answered when I called, but her voice carried no warmth. She had lost her husband to prison, her illusions to testimony, and somewhere in the wreckage, she had lost her anchor to me as well. I understood, even as it hollowed me. Sophie visited sometimes after school. She would sit on the back porch, backpack at her feet, asking quiet questions about her grandfather, about what Frank had taught me in business, about why roses bloomed even after neglect. I gave her pieces of truth wrapped gently so they would not bruise her more than life already had. Still, the evenings stretched long. I would walk the garden paths Frank once laid with his own hands, the gravel crunching underfoot, and feel the cold bite of gossip behind curtained windows. It would have been easy to let bitterness bloom in me, to believe my life had been reduced to scandal. But one night, as I watched the roses bending under rain, the truth settled over me like a steadying hand. Dignity is not granted by courts, neighbors, or even children. It is not something handed over like an inheritance. It is something we hold onto ourselves, stubbornly, like roots gripping soil against storm. Mark had tried to strip it from me with poison and paper. Laura had nearly let him. The town had whispered. Yet here I was, still standing, still choosing to keep my back straight. I lit a candle that night, not for prayer, but as a marker. I set it beside Frank's photograph and whispered aloud, "Dignity is not bestowed. It is carried. Dignity is not bestowed. It is carried." The candle burned low. I poured a glass of water and set it next to it. A quiet ritual of balance, flame and stillness, loss and endurance. The gossip did not stop the next day. Laura did not call. Sophie's shoulders were still heavy with questions. But I carried a lighter truth inside me. Scandal could stain reputation, but it could not touch the core of who I was. And that, I decided, was enough to begin again. The market was crowded that Saturday, aisles full of chatter and the smell of fresh bread. I walked slowly, scanning shelves without urgency until my eyes landed on a row of glassware, ordinary tumblers, wine glasses, champagne flutes. And there it was, a single flute of clear crystal, standing taller than the rest, its surface catching light like water at dawn. I lifted it from the shelf. It was weightier than I expected, balanced in my hand, flawless. No chip, no scar, no hidden edge, just clean glass, transparent, nothing concealed. I turned it slowly, watching reflections bend across its curve. The chipped flute at home came to mind instantly. For years, I had favored it, sentimental about its imperfection. It had been a marker at every gathering. The glass everyone knew was mine. Mark had known it too. That was why he had chosen it. I bought the new glass without hesitation. The cashier wrapped it in tissue, but I kept it unwrapped in my hand as I walked to the car. The sun glinted through it, scattering light across the pavement. It felt like carrying a piece of clarity. Back home, I placed the glass on the kitchen counter and looked at the chipped flute resting in the cupboard. Its scar seemed more visible now, as though it had been waiting to confess. I carried it outside into the garden, to the place where Frank's roses bloomed strongest. The soil was damp from last night's rain, rich and fragrant. I knelt, my knees pressing into the earth. I held the glass for a long moment, turning it over, remembering how many toasts it had raised. Birthdays, promotions, anniversaries. And then the toast that never was, the sip that nearly ended me. "Enough," I whispered. I dug a shallow hollow at the base of the largest rosebush, the one Frank had planted with his bare hands the year Laura was born. I laid the chipped glass down into the earth, its edge catching one last flicker of sunlight before the soil covered it. My palms pressed the dirt firm, the way Frank used to pack soil around tender roots. I stayed kneeling, listening to the wind pass through the branches, carrying faint traces of lake air. The act was small, almost invisible, yet it carried a weight larger than any courtroom verdict. That glass had been my identifier, the object Mark had counted on to mark me for erasure. By burying it, I marked the end of his claim on my life. When I stood, the roses seemed taller. Their blooms glowed crimson, petals soft but edged with thorns, a reminder of strength and fragility coiled together. I brushed my fingers lightly across one bloom. "He will not use me again," I murmured. Inside, I washed the new crystal flute carefully, set it in the cabinet alone, apart. I poured sparkling water into it, lifted it to the light, and took a slow sip. The taste was clean, untouched, no trace of bitterness. It slid down like a promise. That evening, Sophie came by with her school books. She noticed the glass immediately. New? She asked, curiosity glinting in her teenage eyes. Yes, I said. The old one is gone. She tilted her head, sensing meaning, but not pressing. She had always been sharp, quicker than most adults gave her credit for. She smiled softly. It suits you. We sat together at the table while she studied, the glass between us catching the lamplight. I thought of the circle closing, from the chipped flute that nearly ended me, to the crystal one that reminded me I was still here. Neighbors still whispered. Laura still kept her distance, lost in her own storm. But in that small act, burying the chipped glass and lifting the new, I felt a line redraw itself. I wasn't erasing history. I was choosing where to set it down. Later that night, before bed, I stepped out into the garden once more. The soil where I'd buried the glass looked smooth, undisturbed. The rose above it stood proud, a sentinel over the secret. I imagined roots winding around the buried flute, reclaiming it, turning its story into something that would feed new growth. I whispered into the night air, to Frank, to myself. The circle is closed. The scar stays in the ground. I carry only the bloom. Then I went inside, poured another glass of water into the crystal flute, and raised it. Not to anyone else, not to any crowd, but to my own reflection in the window. Quiet victory, quiet dignity. Enough. 3 months later, the roses bloomed as if they had been saving themselves. The bushes thickened, the canes climbed, and the air along the back fence smelled faintly of pepper and honey. I watered in the early mornings, moving the hose in slow arcs while mist lifted off the lake. The house had quieted into a rhythm that made sense again. Coffee, letters, a walk under the elms, small tasks finished without anyone watching the clock. The new crystal flute lived by the sink, clean and bright. When light passed through it, the kitchen filled with a pale ribbon, and I took that as a kind of blessing. Evelyn arrived with a lattice pie on a Tuesday. She rang once and waited, her posture dignified in a way that was new. I noticed it before I noticed the pie. The woman who used to stand like a question now stood like a sentence. She had asked permission her entire life. Now she simply asked for tea. We carried the pie to the porch and ate it warm, the crust flaking onto paper plates, the filling staining our forks red. She told me she had started attending a discussion circle at the library, a group for caretakers and mothers, and that she had spoken there for the first time. I said my son did a terrible thing, she offered, eyes level, and that loving him does not mean lying for him. The words did not tremble. I poured more tea. How did it feel, I asked, to say it where people could hear you? Like standing up after years on my knees. She answered, and a small smile tugged at her mouth. I thought the roof might collapse. It did not. We watched a wasp hover near the far hedge, then veer away. The lake held a sheet of light. A boat moved slowly without hurry. Evelyn smoothed her skirt and glanced at the rose that marked the old glass's grave. Do the roots ever push something like that back up? She asked, after it has been buried? Sometimes storms work things loose, I said, If it rises, I will put it deeper." She nodded, as if that settled more than horticulture. We sat quietly in the kind of silence that is earned, not enforced. Across the table, her hands looked steady. A woman does not become new in one season, but she can repot herself. And I could see that Evelyn had. Late afternoon, Laura texted to ask if she could stop by. Her messages had become careful and brief, like steps on ice. I told her she could come. Evelyn touched my wrist. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. "Stay," I said. "You are part of the truth." Laura arrived with the light behind her, which made it hard to read her face at first. When my eyes adjusted, I saw a version of my daughter I recognized, and did not. Shoulders squared by effort, eyes ringed by weeks of poor sleep, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. She paused at the edge of the porch, as if the floorboards were a shoreline she was not sure she had permission to cross. "Mom," she said. "Evelyn." She looked from one of us to the other and then down at the roses. "May I sit?" I gestured to the chair. She did not reach for me. I did not reach for her. The space between us felt honest in a way that was not cruel. "I came to say I am sorry," Laura began. The words came without decoration. "I am sorry for not believing you. I am sorry for asking you to leave your home. I am sorry for handing you papers I did not read with clear eyes. I am sorry for the hurt I helped carry into this porch." Evelyn's teacup clicked softly against its saucer. I held mine without drinking. Laura stared at her hands. I wanted safety so badly, I mistook control for care. I thought if I could arrange everything, nothing could break. I see now that I was breaking you to keep my picture intact. I let the wind move through the moment. The roses rustled as though turning a page. "Thank you for speaking plainly," I said. "It matters." Laura took a breath. "I also came to tell you what I am doing, not what I want from you. I have withdrawn from the Sunset Hills application. I am meeting with a counselor each week. I have started paying the mortgage with tutoring work. I am not asking you to fix anything. I am asking you to let me fix what I can." Evelyn glanced at me, and I saw pride there that did not belong to biology. I felt something loosen, not forgiveness exactly, more like slack in a rope that had been pulled too tight. Laura lifted her eyes. "If you ever invite me in for dinner, I will come. If you need me to leave, I will go. I do not expect hugs. I do not expect trust. I will live with the distance I created." I set my cup down and rose. At the threshold, I stopped. The exact place where I had once stepped aside for officers and evidence. Boundaries live in wood and hinges as much as they live in the body. I opened the door wide enough for air and light, not wide enough for an embrace. I nodded. Laura's shoulders trembled, then steadied. She nodded back. "Thank you," she said. She turned to Evelyn. "Thank you for telling the truth." Evelyn inclined her head. "Truth does not ask our permission. It only asks our courage." Laura left without looking back. The boards held her weight, then released it. I watched her walk down the path Frank had set with gravel, the stones bright in the sun. When the gate clicked, the porch exhaled. Evelyn and I sat again. We finished the pie, small bites, not needing to fill the air. A cardinal hopped along the fence and scolded a squirrel for getting too close to the feeder. Inside, the crystal flute caught the lowering light and cast a thin blade across the counter. "Two women," Evelyn said, half to herself. who used to apologize for breathing. And here we are, I repeated. I stood to collect the plates. From the porch, I could see the rose over the buried glass lifting its newest bud. It would open tomorrow or the day after. Some closures arrive with gavels, some with nods at doorways, some with a flower that decides this is the day. I carried the dishes inside, set them by the sink, and felt the house settle around us. Not smaller, not larger, just right. The letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between utility bills and seed catalogs. I recognized Sophie's handwriting immediately. Slanted, urgent. The way she wrote when she wanted words to move faster than her thoughts. I carried the envelope inside, sat at the kitchen table with the crystal flute beside me, and opened it with careful hands. Grandma, it began, I have news. I've been awarded a full scholarship to study law. I want to tell you why. I want to do this because of you. My eyes blurred before I reached the second line. I took a breath, steadied myself, and kept reading. I watched everything that happened to you. I watched how people doubted, how even Mom didn't see clearly until it was almost too late. I watched neighbors whisper as though survival was scandal. But you stood tall. You didn't yell. You didn't break. You fought with papers, with roses, with silence that said more than shouting ever could. I want to fight like that, for people who cannot fight for themselves. The words carried me back through months I thought had already been folded away. The courtroom's airless weight, the chipped glass under the soil, Laura's tears on the porch. And now Sophie, writing with the steadiness of someone older than her years. Most of my friends want law because they dream of big firms or politics. I want it because I saw how close you came to losing everything. Not just money, but your name, your independence, your dignity. If it happened to you, it can happen to anyone. I want to defend people like you, so no one else has to bury a glass to reclaim themselves. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. Frank's roses nodded outside the window, their petals wide in the morning light. Sophie's voice rose in my head as I read her final lines. Grandma, you always told me strength isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing who you are and not letting anyone take that from you. I carry that with me. I can be young. I can be learning. But I will never be blind again. You may feel old, but you are not powerless. Because of you, I know neither am I. I folded the letter back into its envelope, then unfolded it again. Some words are not meant to stay hidden. They are meant to be spoken, to echo. I read it aloud, slowly, letting each line fill the kitchen. My voice trembled but did not break. The house seemed to listen. The walls that had carried silence now carried her promise. I imagined her at a desk, pen racing, heart burning with the kind of purpose that no betrayal can dim. A new generation, choosing to build from truth rather than lies. I stood and walked outside to the roses. The soil where I had buried the chipped glass was firm, a bud swelling above it. I read the last sentence again, voice steady. You may feel old, but you are not powerless. The phrase threaded itself into me, not as flattery, but as fact. I whispered it back into the air, my own vow answering hers. I may be old, but I am never powerless. The words lingered, a thematic echo that bound the story into a circle, from the poisoned glass to the crystal one, from Mark's lies to Sophie's clarity, from Evelyn's silence to her truth, from Laura's blindness to her first halting steps of sight, and me, standing with roses at my back, knowing dignity was not something given or taken. It was something I had carried all along. The letter trembled in my hand, but my heart was calm. I pictured Sophie in a courtroom someday, standing firm, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. A granddaughter who had seen the cost of silence and chosen to speak. I slipped the letter into the album where Frank's photographs lived, next to the one where he held Laura's tiny hand by the lake. Another circle. Another anchor. The evening light spilled across the garden. I poured sparkling water into the crystal flute, raised it to the horizon, and let Sophie's words ring in me one last time. I may be old, but I am never powerless. And for the first time in months, I felt not just survival, but renewal. The lake was still that morning, the kind of stillness that makes you whisper without knowing why. I carried my tray to the bench Frank built years ago, the wood now silvered by weather, but steady under me. On the tray sat my teapot, steam curling, and the crystal glass I had chosen to use for tea. Old habits would have demanded porcelain, but today I wanted to feel the weight of clear glass in my hand. I poured slowly. The amber liquid caught the early sun. No blemish, no crack, nothing hidden. I lifted it, and for a moment I simply looked, at the light bending through its sides, at the way it reflected the roses that lined the path to the water. Those roses had grown thick since spring, stubborn and radiant, proof that roots hold even after storms. I sipped, the warmth spreading through me, and my eyes drifted across the lake. I could almost see Frank there, his figure steady on the dock, his hand lifting to wave. I whispered, "I kept myself, Frank." I did not let them take me. The words were not prayer exactly, but they felt like a promise sent into air and water. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of roses. I thought of Evelyn, who had found her voice after decades of silence. I thought of Laura, standing on the porch, her apology measured, her distance necessary. I thought of Sophie, with her scholarship letter pressed into my album, her words echoing through me. You may be old, but you are never powerless. The chipped flute lay buried under those roses now, roots weaving around it, turning pain into soil. The crystal one gleamed in my hand. That was the circle. That was survival turned into renewal. Neighbors still looked twice when I passed. Some would never forget the scandal. But scandal fades. What remains is the quiet knowledge that dignity is not theirs to give or take. It is mine to hold. And I have held it. I raised the glass once more. Not to a crowd. Not to family who had doubted me. But to myself. Clear, unbroken, transparent. The kind of glass no one could mistake for weakness again. If you've ever been overlooked, I said softly, if you've ever been told your place is smaller than it is, remember this. Silence, when chosen, speaks louder than 1,000 shouts. The lake rippled, as though answering back. Before I close this chapter with you, I want to ask something simple. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee in your hand? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if my story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, and in second chances. Thank you for giving me your time today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly, until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.